Physerans screeched in guttural horror as their decapitated limbs littered the battlefield. Human soldiers effortlessly carving through the terrified alien ranks with massive human-engineered war beasts that snarled and snapped bone between bloodied jaws, even as Mizaran plasma rifles proved pathetically useless against the beast's radiation-hardened skin. The Mizarian Emperor Linux watched from his capital ship, Dominion's high vantage point, as the planet Zephyria, site of the humans' last stand, held out against his empire's formerly undefeated fleets. His second-in-command Kravox, face marred by battle scars, reported that multiple human vessels had appeared from hyperspace, disgorging these terrifying creatures called dogs onto many Mizaran-occupied worlds. The Dominion's bridge crew fell silent as Linux stared out at their unstoppable empire's first defeat in a century of conquest. Suddenly, the bridge's starboard wall exploded inward as a hulking, armored human warrior riding a snarling war beast crashed through, rolling to his feet in a combat crouch. His gleaming black armor, scarred by 1,000 battles, stood out against the polished bridge. "I'm Chris Campbell. Your genocide ends now," the human growled. Kravox leapt forward, energy blade humming, but the human's gauntlet flashed out snake-quick, catching the Mizaran by the throat. Chris casually snapped Kravox's spine with an audible crunch before turning cold eyes on Linux. The Emperor's personal guard surged forward to protect their leader, but the titanic armored war beast leapt among them, fangs and claws shredding the helpless Mizarans to ribbons as the human calmly advanced on Linux's command throne. Reports came in of similar scenes erupting across the Mizaran's fractured empire as human super soldiers riding their massive bioengineered dog war mounts advanced relentlessly, heedless of plasma fire sloughing off their shields. Mizaran forces reeled as their armies, undefeated for generations, simply ceased to exist under the humans' furious onslaught. Linux had scarcely managed to trigger his emergency force field when Chris Campbell's pulse blasts dropped the bridge crew's bodies to the deck with ruthless speed. The human super soldier stormed forward, his crackling energy blade arcing through the air. It carved a molten path through Linux's ceremonial armor, biting deep into the flesh of his chest. The Emperor roared in pain and rage as he staggered back, viscous purple ichor seeping from the wound. He barked for reinforcements, even as he raised his own saber in a futile attempt to parry Campbell's inexorable advance. Within heartbeats, the bridge swarmed with a rush of Mizaran elite guards, disruptor rifles leveled squarely at the lone human warrior. Campbell's lips curled back from his teeth in a feral grin. He let out a piercing whistle, and the bridge's blast doors buckled and tore like foil. His mount, the hulking Dreadwolf, exploded through the rent metal, sending Mizaran soldiers flying. The bioengineered killing machine fell upon the guards in a whirlwind of fang and claw, its gene-boosted musculature and carbon-ceramic armor weathering their panicked salvo with contemptuous ease. Mizaran warriors crumpled like rag dolls, their advanced technology useless against the savagery of Campbell's beast. As the Dreadwolf ravaged his guards, Linux found himself beset by the humans' relentless bladework. Their weapons crashed together in blinding showers of sparks, the Emperor giving ground with each exchange. The stench of fear musk began to overpower even the tang of blood on the air. The tide of battle had long since turned in the void surrounding Zephyria. The rest of Campbell's vanguard streaked and dove through the cumbersome Mizarian fleet. Genetically modified war drakes belched plasma into the drives of battleships, while razor-taloned avian horrors raked and shredded fighter screens, their riders' pulse cannons and grav-lances reaping a dreadful toll. On the planet's surface, the Emperor's occupying force found itself routed and scattered, as the human resistance took back their cities one block at a time. Reeves and his Thunder Tusk crashed through their defenses as if they were made of paper, the beast's iridium alloy trunk and curling tusk scattering tanks like children's toys. Reeves fired his shoulder-mounted railgun into the breach, the hypersonic tungsten spikes coursing through the armor of artillery emplacements and bunkers. Newly liberated Zephyrians rallied to the humans' cause, their thirst for vengeance lending desperate strength to their blows as they fell upon their oppressors with salvaged weapons. Back on the dying bridge of the Dominion, Campbell and Linux's dance had reached its crescendo. The Emperor was a hair's breadth from breaking, fatigue and blood loss taking their toll. He cast a frantic gaze around the smoke-choked chamber, seeking escape. Campbell saw his opening and lunged forward, armored boots slamming Linux to the floor in an unceremonious heap of twisted limbs. The human leveled his pulse pistol at the tyrant's sweat-slicked face as his blade tumbled from nerveless fingers. "Your reign ends here, Linux," Campbell said, each word edged in promise, "but your punishment is just beginning." Linux's bulbous eyes flew wide with dawning horror as the human's true goal crashed home. This upstart primitive meant not to grant him a clean death, but to drag him before a tribunal and lay bare his myriad atrocities before the galaxy entire. And with his fleet broken and his armies crushed beneath the human's beast-riding hordes, no force in the verse could stop Campbell's justice from being done. The Emperor opened his jaws to unleash a final defiant curse. But Campbell's final curse died on Linux's lips, as the human's dreadwolf pinned the Emperor down with a massive paw, drool dripping from its maw onto the Mizaran's face. Campbell strode forward and snapped a pair of titanium cuffs around Linux's wrists. "All right, people, we've got the package. Sweep and clear, then lock this bucket down tight." Campbell barked into his comms. His strike team moved with practiced efficiency, securing key systems and corridors. Within minutes, the Dominion was theirs. Campbell marched Linux to the bridge at gunpoint. He shoved the Emperor into a seat and activated the ship-wide broadcast. "Attention, all Mizaran forces. This is Colonel Chris Campbell of the Terran Expeditionary Force. Your Emperor is now in our custody. You've seen what our beast can do. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Across Zephyria and the void around it, Mizaran troops threw down their weapons. Grav tanks powered down. Dropships settled to the ground and disgorged their complement of soldiers, hands raised. But not everyone was ready to submit. Traitorous filth! Kravox's face purpled with rage as he watched legions of his warriors capitulate. The Emperor's fist does not yield. The cyborg Mizaran rallied his own elite cadre, 1,000 of the finest soldiers ever to march beneath the imperial banner. "We will crush these upstarts and hang their corpses from the palace gates." Kravox goaded his men into a frenzy, and they took up a thunderous chant. Death to the Terran scum. Bolstered by the fanatical cries, the Emperor's fist charged across the blasted earth, plasma cannons primed and hungry for blood. Campbell watched their approach from the Dominion's spotters, eyes hard. He had anticipated this eventuality. At his signal, the ground erupted in a storm of matted fur and slavering jaws as hundreds of dreadwolves, thunder tusks, and other nightmarish war beasts burst from their camouflaged hiding spots. They fell upon Kravox's troops in a hurricane of fang and claw. Men screamed as dreadwolves shredded armor like paper, sinking monomolecular teeth into the flesh beneath. Thunder tusks gored soldiers on their iridium tusks or crushed them beneath tree-trunk feet. No Mizaran weapon could seem to penetrate their hides. But the Emperor's fist would not be undone so easily. With a roar of "For Linux!" Kravox unloaded his plasma cannon into the nearest dreadwolf. The beast's head disintegrated in a red mist. All around him, his shock troops engaged their jump packs, leaping clear of the slaughter to rain superheated death on the monsters below. Creatures that had weathered bullets and blades, with scarcely a scratch, now writhed and burned beneath the fury of the fist's onslaught. The smell of seared meat mingled with the ozone tang of plasma. On the Dominion, Campbell watched in dismay as his beautiful beast succumbed to this new weapon. He snarled and punched the bulkhead. "Helm, put us on an intercept course with that landing area now." The helmsman hesitated only a moment before obeying. The massive battleship lurched as its engines flared to life, bearing them towards the maelstrom below. Campbell was already moving, sprinting for the nearest airlock. He keyed his comms as he ran. "Izumi Yao, hold the bridge and watch our guest. Reeves, you have the con until I return." Static crackled in his ears, barely audible over the thunder of his armored boots. "Chris, what the hell are you doing?" Reeves's voice was taut with concern even across the comms. "Evening the odds. Keep her steady and don't wait up." And with that, Campbell reached the airlock. The portal cycled open and he flung himself into the void without a second thought. The wind howled in Campbell's ears as he plummeted like a stone, Zephyria's arid landscape yawning wide beneath him. With a thought he activated his thrusters, altering his trajectory towards the thick of the fighting. Their targeting reticle flickered to life on his HUD, picking out the whirling melee of flesh and steel rushing up to greet him. He marked Kravoks with a thought and bared his teeth in a savage grin. His energy blade flared to life in his fist as the battlefield loomed large before him. At the last possible instant, Campbell threw his arms and legs wide, letting his armor's grav panels and repulsors arrest his momentum with bone-jarring force. He landed in a crouch amid the storm of fire and blood, steam rising from his superheated armor. With a scream of tortured metal, the colonel launched himself at the nearest knot of enemies, blade flashing. He parried a plasma bolt and clove the offending trooper from shoulder to hip, armor sparking where the blade clashed against cybernetic implants. His other hand found his pulse pistol, and he put a shot through the optics of another Mizaran, before reversing his grip and slamming the weapon's stock into the faceplate of a third with a shattering crunch. All around Campbell, the battle raged at a fever pitch. Mizaran and beast grappled and died, neither side yielding an inch of the blood-churned earth. A thunder tusk trumpeted in agony as plasma fire melted its face to slag. A pack of dreadwolves bore a squad of troopers to the ground, worrying at the screaming soldiers like ragdolls. With their alpha in the fray, the surviving war beasts fought with redoubled savagery, giving as good as they got. Campbell pressed the attack, steadily cutting a path of carnage towards Kravoks's position. The Mizaran commander saw him coming and unleashed a barrage of plasma at the charging human. Campbell jinked and wove between the shots, trusting in his armor and reflexes. Superheated near misses seared his pauldrons and greaves, but he pushed through the pain, never slowing. Kravoks snarled and made to fire again, but Campbell was already inside his guard. The human's blade slashed down in a blinding arc, shearing through the Mizaran's cannon and the arm beneath in a spray of sparks and blood. Kravoks stared at the smoking stump of his gun arm in shock, then opened his mouth to bellow orders. Campbell lunged forward and rammed his blade to the hilt in the alien's chest, the point bursting from his back in a shower of gore. The colonel ripped his sword free in a vicious spray, letting Kravoks's body topple like a felled tree. He thrust the blade skyward and roared, "Terrans! To me!" The war beasts and remaining human soldiers rallied to his cry, crashing into the Emperor's fist with unbridled ferocity. Deprived of their leader, the cyborg elites finally broke, scattering in 100 directions only to be run down by vengeful fangs and claws. Campbell and his troops harried the fleeing Mizarans across the blasted plain, their blood-drenched beasts ensuring that none escaped to threaten the newly freed Zephyria. As the last of the Emperor's fist fell, Campbell trudged back to the grounded Dominion, gore-streaked but victorious. He found Reeves and the others waiting on the lowered boarding ramp, the battered but defiant form of Linux held between them. The Emperor glowered, but offered no resistance as Campbell approached. The colonel stopped before the once mighty tyrant and seized his jaw in a grip like an industrial vice, forcing the alien to meet his eyes. Linux's gaze was poison, but there was fear there too. He knew what came next. Campbell released him with a disgusted shove and activated his comms. "This is Colonel Campbell to all free worlds. The Mizaran Empire has fallen, Zephyria is free, and their thrice-damned emperor is now our prisoner. I know you're scared, I know you're war-weary, but I promise you this is just the beginning." Campbell's voice crackled across the galaxy, his words a clarion call to the newly freed worlds. "The Mizarian Empire has fallen, but our work is far from over. We must remain vigilant, for there are those who would see tyranny return." On Argus Prime, the streets seethed with a roiling mob, Mizarian and Argusian alike baying for blood. They parted before Campbell and Shadow like a turbulent sea before a destroyer's prow, primal fear warring with the thirst for vengeance in their eyes. Campbell strode to the center of the square, his midnight black dreadwolf padding at his side. The war criminal knelt there, bound and beaten, his once pristine uniform now tattered and stained. Campbell hauled the Mizarian to his feet, his grip on the male's collar, unbreakable as neutronium. This man stands accused of crimes against sentience, of murder, torture, and enslavement on a planetary scale. Today he faces justice. Campbell's voice rang out, echoing from the towering buildings. Mizarian, Argusian, and 100 other races watched, the weight of history pressing down upon them all. Far away on Verdania, Titan's armored bulk shattered the jungle's Viridian embrace, Mizarian weapons fire ricocheting from his ivory plates. Reeves guided the Thunder Tusk with a touch, his other hand sending railgun slugs through canopy and hostile flesh alike. Plasma beams lit the twilight gloom, their actinic glare painting the vines and ferns in lurid shades of death. Reeves's team advanced through the chaos, their own mounts and weapons adding to the storm of destruction. They hit the Mizarian base like a fusion warhead, ferrocrete and alien metal crumpling beneath Titan's charge. Reeves leapt from the Thunder Tusk's back, his railgun spitting depleted uranium death as he rolled to his feet. His team fanned out behind him, energy blades and pulse rifles making short, savage work of any Mizarian foolish enough to stand and fight. They moved through the base with ruthless efficiency, cutting down Zaxor's elite killers and freeing the captives huddled in the depths. On Shadowlair, the night erupted with the thunderous staccato of Mizarian anti-air batteries, lancing the darkness with searing beams of coherent light. Campbell and his strike force dove through the firestorm, their dreadwolves twisting and banking with impossible grace. They hit the ground running, weapons already spitting death as they sprinted for Zax's compound. Shadow's claws rent metal and flesh with equal ease, the dreadwolf a whirlwind of obsidian death at Campbell's side. They crashed through the compound's outer walls like the wrath of an angry god, their weapons flashing as they cut down the Mizarian defenders. Alarms blared and plasma beams crisscrossed the corridors, but Campbell and his team pushed forward with inexorable determination. Reeves and Titan hit the Mizarian forces like a hammer blow, the Thunder Tusk scattering their ranks like ninepins. Reeves stood atop his mount like a demigod of war, his railgun sending supersonic death into the heart of the enemy formation. Campbell kicked down the door to Zaxor's command center, his pulse pistol already leveled at the Mizarian general's head. Zaxor smiled, his teeth flashing in the dimness, and pressed a button on his wrist console. A klaxon blared, and a cold mechanical voice echoed through the room. Self-destruct sequence initiated. Detonation in T-5 minutes. Campbell didn't hesitate. Reeves, get everyone out now. Shadow, with me, we're shutting this thing down. The dreadwolf growled his assent, muscles coiling beneath his ebony hide. They ran, Campbell's armor feeding him the countdown as they raced through the compound's labyrinthine corridors. Zaxor's laughter chased them, a promise of oblivion nipping at their heels. The reactor room's harsh lighting glinted off Campbell's sweat-slick brow as he worked feverishly at the self-destruct's control panel. His armored fingers flew over the unfamiliar Mizarian interface, searching for a way to disable the deadly countdown. Shadow prowled the room's perimeter, his enhanced senses straining for any sign of threat. 2 minutes to detonation, the computer's calm, inflectionless voice announced. Campbell's jaw tightened, he had to hurry. Shadow's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Campbell followed his companion's gaze to the device's power source, a pulsing crystal matrix. Of course. Remove the power, and the countdown would stop. But one wrong move could trigger the explosion prematurely. Campbell carefully pried open the matrix housing, revealing the softly glowing crystal within. It thrummed with barely contained energy, casting eerie shadows across the human's determined features. He reached for the crystal, hands steady despite the stakes. Just as his fingers brushed the matrix's surface, a hidden door hissed open. Campbell spun, pulse pistols leaping into his hands as Shadow bared his fangs. Zaxor stumbled through the opening, his once immaculate uniform scorched and bloody. The Mizarian general's eyes blazed with hatred as he leveled his plasma rifle at Campbell. "I will not leave this place alive, human filth," Zaxor snarled, opening fire. Superheated plasma scorched the air as Campbell dove for cover, the bolts sizzling against the reactor's housing. He returned fire, pulse rounds ricocheting off the walls in a dazzling display. Shadow lunged, a blur of obsidian fur and rippling muscle. His jaws clamped down on Zax's gun arm with a sickening crunch. The general screamed, his weapon clattering to the floor as he struggled against the Dreadwolf's unyielding grip. Campbell seized the opening, charging forward and slamming the butt of his pistol against Zax's temple. The Mizarian crumpled, his eyes rolling back in his head as he slipped into unconsciousness. 1 minute to detonation, the computer intoned, its voice echoing in the sudden stillness. Campbell turned back to the Matrix, his mind racing. No more time for caution. He gripped the crystal and yanked, wincing as energy arced across his armor. The Matrix came free with a hiss, the countdown stuttering to a halt. Campbell sagged against the console, his heart hammering in his chest. Shadow nudged his hand, concern evident in the beast's intelligent eyes. The human managed a weary smile, scratching his companion behind the ears. They made their way back through the compound, stepping over the bodies of fallen Mizarians. The rest of the team was waiting at the extraction point, their own creatures standing guard. Reeves greeted Campbell with a nod, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the unconscious Zaxor slung over Shadow's back. Campbell shook his head. Fun's not the word I'd use. He glanced up at the stars, his expression pensive. This is just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. As the team boarded their ship and prepared for the journey back to Earth, Campbell couldn't shake the feeling that their victory here was just a brief respite. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and there would always be new threats to face. The console beeped, drawing him from his thoughts. An urgent message from command scrolled across the screen, and Campbell's eyes narrowed as he read the contents. The Kurzoth. He had heard whispers of this new alien race, rumors of their ruthless conquests and advanced technology. And now they had set their sights on the territory, so recently freed from Mizarian rule. Campbell's hands tightened on the console's edge. He would not let another tyrant fill the void left by the Mizarians. He would stand against the Kurzoth, no matter the cost. He turned to his team, his expression grim. Looks like we've got our next mission. The Kurzoth are moving in on the border worlds. Command wants us to investigate and engage if necessary. Reeves cracked his knuckles, a feral grin spreading across his face. Sounds like a party. When do we leave? Immediately. Campbell brought up a star map, the Kurzoth's suspected territory glowing an angry red. Prep your gear and your creatures. We're going in hot. As the team dispersed to make their preparations, Campbell lingered at the map, his eyes tracing the vast expanse of space. The Kurzoth were a new and dangerous foe, but he had faith in his team and their beasts. They had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. And they would do so again. For the sake of the galaxy, they had to. Campbell straightened, his resolve hardening into a cold, implacable core. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face, he and his team would meet them head-on. The Kurzoth would learn, as the Mizarians had, the folly of underestimating the humans and their creatures. Campbell would make sure of it. As the Terran strike force hurtled through the void towards Kurzoth space, the sleek hull of their ship shuddered under the impact of microasteroids. In the dimly lit hold, Shadow paced restlessly, his ebony fur bristling with anticipation. Campbell ran a hand over the Dreadwolf's muscular flank, feeling the tension coiled beneath the beast's skin. The journey had been far from smooth. Uncharted regions of space presented a host of hazards, from treacherous asteroid fields that threatened to tear the ship apart to intense radiation storms that battered their shields and seared exposed flesh. Strange, hostile lifeforms had assaulted them at every turn, drawn to the vessel's energy signatures like moths to a flame. But Campbell's team had not come unprepared. The genetically modified creatures that accompanied them were more than mere pets or mascots. They were an integral part of the force, each bred and trained for a specific purpose. The Dreadwolves' keen senses had proven invaluable in detecting hidden dangers lurking in the void, while the Thunder Tusk's immense strength and resilience allowed them to plow through the toughest of barriers, both physical and otherwise. As they approached the outskirts of Kurzoth territory, Campbell called a meeting in the ship's briefing room. The holographic display flickered to life, casting an eerie blue glow over the assembled faces of his team. "We've got a problem," Campbell said without preamble. "The situation is more complex than we anticipated." He tapped a command into the console, and the hologram zoomed in on a cluster of star systems near the border of Kurzoth space. Red icons flashed, indicating known enemy positions and fortifications. "Not only are the Kurzoth a formidable military power in their own right," Campbell continued, "but they've also managed to forge alliances with several other races." The display shifted, highlighting a number of smaller, unfamiliar emblems alongside the angular sigil of the Kurzoth, including some former Mizarian vassal states that still harbor resentment towards us for our role in toppling their empire. A murmur of unease rippled through the room. The Mizarian campaign had been long and bloody, and the scars it left on the galaxy were still raw. Campbell held up a hand for silence. "That's not the worst of it," he said grimly. "We've intercepted communications that suggest the Kurzoth have somehow acquired samples of our genetically modified creatures. They're working to reverse engineer their own versions as we speak." The implications hung heavy in the air. If the Kurzoth succeeded in replicating the humans' greatest weapons, it would negate their main tactical advantage and put them on an even playing field with the ruthless warlords. "We need to act fast," Campbell said, his jaw set with determination. "We can't let them complete their research." He brought up a schematic of a sprawling complex on the hologram, the Kurzoth's main military research facility. "Shadow and I will lead a small strike team to infiltrate the base and destroy the samples before they can be fully analyzed. But we'll need a diversion to draw their attention away from our true objective." Campbell turned to Reeves, who stood at the back of the room with his arms folded across his broad chest. "That's where you come in, Marcus. You and Titan will take the rest of the team and launch an assault on this outpost here." Another icon flashed on the display, a Kurzoth military installation not far from the research facility. With the plan set in motion, Campbell's strike team boarded a small, stealthy shuttle and slipped away from the main ship, gliding silently towards the research facility. They landed in a secluded ravine a few clicks from the base, the shuttle's matte black hull blending seamlessly with the shadows. Campbell and Shadow led the way, the Dreadwolf's enhanced senses guiding them through the maze of rocky outcroppings and jagged crevasses that surrounded the complex. The other creatures followed close behind, their lithe forms slipping through the darkness with preternatural grace. As they approached the facility's perimeter, they could hear the distant sounds of battle erupting from the direction of the military outpost. Reeves and Titan's diversion was underway. The Kurzoth guards at the research base stirred uneasily, their attention divided between the sudden commotion and their own posts. Campbell seized the opportunity, signaling his team to move in. They breached the outer defenses in a blur of motion, the creature's claws and teeth rending metal and flesh with brutal efficiency. Alarms blared and plasma bolts sizzled through the air as the Kurzoth rallied to meet the intruders. But Campbell's team was already inside, fighting their way deeper into the complex. They raced through the twisting corridors, following the schematics Campbell had memorized. Kurzoth soldiers and their own genetically enhanced beasts poured out to bar their way, but the humans and their creatures met them head-on, energy blades flashing and pulse rifles chattering. At last, they reached the central laboratory, a cavernous chamber filled with banks of humming equipment and glowing tanks. Inside, Campbell could see the twisted forms of half-finished creatures floating in viscous fluid, the Kurzoth's attempts to recreate their own versions of the humans' bioweapons. But there was more. As they fanned out to secure the room, Campbell's gaze fell upon a massive holographic display dominating the far wall. It showed schematics for a weapon of unimaginable destructive power, a planet killer that made the Mizarian doomsday devices look like children's toys. Before they could begin to process this new revelation, the lab's far doors slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. A towering figure strode through, flanked by a pair of monstrous, heavily armed creatures that bore a chilling resemblance to the humans' own dreadwolves. Welcome, Terrans, the Kurzoth warlord rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. I am Kralox, and I'm afraid I cannot allow you to leave this place alive. With a roar, Kralox's bodyguards lunged forward, their razor-sharp claws gouging deep furrows in the metal flooring. Shadow and the other creatures met them in a clash of flesh and fury, the lab's confined spaces and delicate equipment turning the battle into a deadly dance of destruction. Campbell squared off against Kralox himself, the warlord's crackling energy blade meeting his own in a shower of sparks. They traded blows back and forth across the lab, weaving between shattering tanks and toppling equipment as each sought to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the facility, Reeves and the diversion team found themselves facing a much larger Kurzoth force than they had anticipated. The warlord had secretly deployed reinforcements to the outpost, and now Titan and the other creatures were slowly being overwhelmed by the sheer number and firepower of the enemy troops. Reeves gritted his teeth as he fired his railgun into the advancing horde, each high-velocity slug punching through multiple Kurzoth soldiers before burying itself in the wall behind them. But for every enemy he felled, two more seemed to take their place, an endless tide of fangs and claws and plasma fire. He knew they couldn't hold out forever, but they had to buy more time for Campbell's team to complete their mission, no matter the cost, even if it meant sacrificing themselves in the process. Back in the lab, Campbell pressed his attack, his energy blade flashing as he drove Kralox back step by step. The warlord was skilled, but he was no match for the human's raw tenacity and the advanced technology of his armored suit. With a final desperate lunge, Campbell knocked Kralox's blade aside and brought his own up in a scything arc. The warlord stumbled back, his weapon arm severed at the elbow, and fell to his knees in submission. Around them, the battle was winding down. Shadow and the other creatures had dispatched Kralox's bodyguards, their broken bodies lying in twisted heaps among the wreckage of the lab. Campbell's team quickly set about planting explosive charges, rigging the entire facility to blow. They had just finished wiring the last detonator when the ground shook with a series of distant explosions. Campbell's head snapped up, his eyes widening in alarm. The diversion team, they must have been overrun. But as they raced out of the collapsing research facility, they emerged into a scene of unexpected triumph. Reeves and the others were still standing, battered and bloodied but alive, and at their side stood a ragtag group of Kurzoth rebels, the warlord's own subjects who had risen up to join the fight against their tyrannical rulers. Together the humans, their creatures, and their new allies fought their way out of the Kurzoth's territory, leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in their wake. The research facility exploded behind them, the shockwave nearly knocking them off their feet as they piled into their waiting shuttle. As they rocketed away from the planet's surface, Campbell leaned back in his seat and let out a long, shuddering breath. They had struck a blow against the Kurzoth today, but he knew this was only the beginning of a much longer war. The warlords would not take this defeat lightly. They would rally their forces, call upon their allies, and come at the humans with everything they had. And Campbell and his team would need to be ready to meet them, to forge new alliances of their own and push the boundaries of their genetically modified creatures' abilities. But for now, as the shuttle hurtled through the starlit void towards the distant gleam of Earth, they could take a moment to rest, to heal, and to savor the bonds of blood and battle that tied them together. Because in the end, it was those bonds that would see them through the dark times ahead. As long as they stood together, they could face any challenge the galaxy saw fit to throw their way. Earth's crowds roared in jubilation as Campbell's strike team descended the ramp of their battered transport, the heroes of the hour returning victorious from their raid on the Kurzoth research facility. Titan stomped down the ramp, armor still scarred and scorched, with Reeves perched on his broad back. Shadow prowled at Campbell's side, the Dreadwolf's ebony fur matted with dried alien blood. Campbell raised a fist in acknowledgement of the cheering throngs, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next battle. The Kurzoth would not take this defeat lightly. Reprisal would be swift and brutal. No sooner had they reached the inner confines of the military base than a uniformed aide rushed to meet them, her face grave. "Colonel Campbell, sir, we have an urgent situation. If you and your team would follow me." In the briefing room, the rebel Kurzoth commander Zolara's holographic image flickered, her reptilian features taut with strain. "The Kurzoth warlords are preparing a massive retaliatory strike," she said, without preamble. "My spies report a gathering armada of unprecedented scale. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands of fighters, and a swarm of war beasts genetically engineered for one purpose: the annihilation of your colonies and all who stand with you. Within a matter of days, a week at most, they will strike without warning or mercy." Reeves cursed under his breath. The room fell silent, the weight of the news settling like a shroud. Campbell straightened, his jaw set. "Then we have no time to lose. We fight." He turned to his team. "Prep every creature, ready every ship and soldier. We reach out to every ally, call in every favor. This is the moment we stand together or fall alone." The next hours passed in a blur of frenzied activity as the human coalition mustered its strength. Warships from a dozen worlds converged on the human fleet, their hulls bristling with weapons. Transports ferried legions of genetically enhanced beasts, dreadwolves, thundertusks, and stranger things, bred and trained for war. And at the head of this mighty armada, Campbell and his team led the charge. As the fleets clashed in the skies above the besieged colonies, the void lit up with the fire of 1,000 suns. Plasma beams and fusion warheads crisscrossed the black, ships dying in brief, brilliant novas. The Kurzoth beasts, twisted and horrific reflections of Campbell's own creatures, rampaged through the human ships, tearing through bulkheads with acid-dripping claws. But they met their match in Shadow, Titan, and their brethren, the decks running slick with blood and viscera as they clashed fang and talon. On the ground, the situation was no less dire. Reeves and Titan spearheaded the defense, rallying the beleaguered garrisons against the Kurzoth onslaught. The Thundertusk charged into the fray, scattering tanks like toys as Reeves' railgun barked death into the enemy ranks. But the Kurzoth kept coming, heedless of loss, driven by hate and a thirst for vengeance. Their monstrous Goliaths, hulking brutes of muscle and metal, shrugged off wounds that would have felled a lesser creature, closing in on all sides. Reeves and Titan found themselves cut off, surrounded. Reeves slammed a fresh magazine into his railgun, the magnetic coils whining with charge. "Looks like this is it, big guy," he said, laying a hand on Titan's flank. "It's been an honor." Titan trumpeted a battle cry and lowered his tusks, ready to sell his life dearly. The Goliaths charged. Above, Campbell and Shadow fought their way through the Kurzoth flagship, a running battle that left corridors choked with the dead. They burst onto the bridge, weapons spitting fire, and there they found Warlord Zorgax waiting, a cruel smile on his face. "You've cost me dearly, human," Zorgax snarled, his energy blade flaring to life. "But your meddling ends here. The Kurzoth will not be denied our destiny." Campbell met the Warlord's charge, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. They traded blows back and forth across the bridge, neither giving ground, the fate of worlds hanging in the balance. Shadow leapt at Zorgax, fastening his jaws around the Warlord's sword arm. Zorgax roared in pain and fury, his blade wavering. Campbell seized the opening, lunging forward to drive his own weapon through Zorgax's black heart. The Warlord fell, and with his death the Kurzoth resistance crumbled. Their ships scattered, fleeing before the human-led onslaught, and their Goliaths toppled, cut down by Reeves's railgun and Titan's tusks. The battle was won, but the cost was high. As the smoke cleared, Campbell and his team regrouped amidst the ruins, battered but unbroken. They had faced the Kurzoth armada and triumphed, but they knew this was only the beginning. In the aftermath, as the coalition tended its wounds and buried its dead, Campbell found himself haunted by the Kurzoth's genetically engineered horrors. What dark science had spawned such abominations? And why did he suspect that the Kurzoth, for all their malevolence, were but pawns in a larger game? He had no answers, only a growing certainty that this war was far from over, and that the greatest challenges, the truest tests of their resolve, were yet to come. Campbell's brow furrowed as he listened to the distress call, the hollow display casting a ghostly blue glow over the bridge of the Dauntless. The Mizarian rebel's voice crackled with static, her words laced with urgency and fear. "Colonel Campbell, we have information that could change the course of this war, but we're under attack by Kozoth-backed loyalists. Please, we need your help." Campbell exchanged a glance with Reeves, who stood at his side, arms folded across his chest. The grizzled veteran gave a slight nod, his eyes hard. They both knew the risks of mounting a rescue mission in the heart of enemy territory, but the potential rewards were too great to ignore. "We're on our way," Campbell said, his voice steady. "Hold tight and stay alive. We'll get you out of there." He turned to his crew, his expression grim. "Prep the Shadowhawk for stealth insertion. Reeves, you're with me. Titan, too. We'll need his muscle for this op." Within minutes, Campbell's strike team had assembled in the Dauntless's hangar bay. Shadow prowled at his side, the Dreadwolf's ebony fur bristling with anticipation. Reeves and Titan stood nearby, the Thundertusk's armored bulk looming over the other creatures and soldiers. Campbell clasped hands with each member of his team, human and beast alike. They had been through hell together, forged bonds stronger than steel in the crucible of war. He knew he could count on them, no matter the odds. As the Shadowhawk tore through the void towards the besieged space station, Campbell pored over the schematics of the installation, committing every corridor and choke point to memory. He and Reeves hashed out a plan of attack, their voices low and urgent over the whine of the engines. The station loomed before them, a twisted mass of metal and flickering lights, scars of battle etched across its surface. Flashes of plasma fire and the silent explosions of breaching charges lit up the void as the Loyalists pressed their assault. Campbell gripped the edge of his seat as the pilot deftly maneuvered the Shadowhawk through the chaos, the ship shuddering as near misses seared its hull. At the last moment, they slipped through the station's compromised defenses, sliding into a docking bay in a shower of sparks. The team leapt from the ship, weapons at the ready, as the bay's atmosphere rushed in around them. The sounds of battle echoed through the corridors, the acrid scent of smoke and ozone hanging heavy in the recycled air. "Reeves, Titan, punch through their front lines and draw their fire," Campbell barked, his voice cutting through the din. "The rest of you with me. We'll find the rebels and get them out." Reeves flashed a feral grin, hefting his railgun. "Give 'em hell, Colonel. We'll keep these bastards busy." With a roar, Titan charged down the corridor, Reeves riding high on his back. They crashed into the Loyalist lines like a tidal wave, scattering soldiers and war beasts alike. The railgun boomed, each shot punching through armor and bone as Titan's tusks and feet crushed those foolish enough to stand in their way. Campbell led his team in the opposite direction, Shadow loping ahead, his enhanced senses guiding them through the labyrinthine passages. They encountered pockets of resistance along the way, Loyalist cyborgs and gene-twisted abominations that hurled themselves at the humans with reckless abandon. But Campbell and his team were a well-oiled machine, years of combat forging them into a single deadly entity. They fought together seamlessly, plasma rifles and energy blades flashing in the dim light, creatures and soldiers moving in perfect sync. Shadow was a blur of obsidian death, his claws and fangs rending metal and flesh alike. He seemed to anticipate Campbell's every move, the two of them fighting as one, an unstoppable force of nature. At last they reached the rebel stronghold, a fortified section of the station's core. The defenders were battered and bloodied, but their eyes shone with fierce determination. At their head stood a grizzled Mizarian, his face a map of scars and battle-worn features. "Zorak, I presume?" Campbell said, lowering his rifle. "Chris Campbell, TF, we're here to get you out." The rebel leader clasped Campbell's hand, his grip strong despite his injuries. "Colonel, your timing is impeccable, but I fear our escape is only the beginning." "The Kozoth are but pawns," he said, his voice grave. "The true threat lies behind them, pulling the strings, an ancient race, long thought extinct, known as the progenitors." Campbell's eyes widened as he scanned the data, realization dawning. The progenitors, the very beings who had created the gene-forged beasts that had turned the tide of the war. And now, a rogue faction sought to use that same technology to conquer the galaxy, unleashing armies of unstoppable monsters and sowing chaos on a scale never before seen. "Shadow Masters," Zorak spat as if the very word were poison. "They must be stopped, Colonel, or all we have fought for will be lost." Campbell's jaw tightened, his mind racing. This changed everything, the scope of the threat, the true nature of their enemy. But it also presented an opportunity, a chance to strike at the heart of the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. "We need to get this intel back to command," he said, his voice steel. "And then we take the fight to the Shadow Masters. We cut off the head of the snake, and the body will die." Zorak nodded, a fierce light in his eyes. "My people are with you, Colonel, to the end." Campbell clasped the rebel leader's shoulder, a warrior's bond forged in the heat of battle. "Let's move out. Reeves, we're heading back to the ship. Be ready for extract." "Roger that," came the reply, punctuated by the boom of the railgun and Titan's bellowing roar. "We'll clear a path." As they fought their way back through the station, the corridors choked with the bodies of the fallen. Campbell's mind was already racing ahead, planning, strategizing. The Shadow Masters thought themselves safe, hidden away in some dark corner of the galaxy. They were about to learn the folly of underestimating the human spirit and the unbreakable bond between warriors and beasts. The Shadowhawk tore free from the station's embrace, engines screaming as it clawed for open space. Behind them, the installation shuddered and cracked, the Loyalists' assault taking its toll. But Campbell's eyes were fixed on the stars ahead, his heart steeled for the battle to come. Back on Earth, the revelation of the Shadow Master's existence sent shockwaves through the Coalition's leadership. Fear and uncertainty gripped even the most stalwart of commanders, the scale of the threat almost too vast to comprehend. But Campbell's voice cut through the tumult, a clarion call to action. "We have a chance here, a chance to end this war once and for all. The Shadow Masters are the key. We take them down, and the Kurzoth will fall." He laid out his plan, bold and audacious, a strike at the very heart of the enemy's power. It would require every resource they had, every ship and beast and soldier, a gamble with the highest of stakes. But as Campbell looked around the room, he saw the fire in their eyes, the determination etched on every face. They had come too far, fought too hard, to falter now. The bond between human and beast, forged in the crucible of war, would be their greatest strength, their most powerful weapon. "We're with you, Colonel," Admiral Zhao said, her voice ringing with conviction. "To the very end." As the War Council dispersed, Campbell found himself alone with Shadow, the Dread Wolf's presence a steadying comfort. He knelt down, running his fingers through the beast's midnight fur, feeling the power and loyalty thrumming beneath. "It's all been leading to this, boy," he murmured, his voice low. "Everything we've fought for, everything we've lost. It all comes down to this." Shadow rumbled deep in his chest, his eyes gleaming with fierce intelligence. Campbell knew that he understood, that the bond between them ran deeper than words could express. Together they walked out onto the command deck, the bustling heart of the Coalition's war effort. Soldiers and beasts alike snapped to attention, the respect and admiration in their eyes a tangible thing. But they would not succeed. Not while Chris Campbell and his warriors stood against them. Not while the bond between human and beast, forged in the fires of war, remained unbroken. The final battle was coming, a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. And Campbell and his team would be there to meet it head-on, to stare into the abyss and refuse to blink. The void beyond the station's hull churned with eldritch energies as the Coalition fleet clashed with the Shadow Master's forces. Ships twisted and burned, shredded by the fury of advanced weaponry. But the true struggle lay within the station's labyrinth depths, where Campbell and his team fought to end the cosmic threat once and for all. Shadow and Titan led the charge, a whirlwind of fangs and fury, as they tore through the Shadow Master's elite warriors. Their genetically enhanced bodies shrugged off wounds that would have felled lesser beasts, their eyes alight with a feral intelligence as they anticipated their foes' every move. Campbell and Reeves fought back-to-back, pulse rifles flaring as they cut a path through the seething tide of monstrous war beasts. The creatures, twisted and misshapen by the Shadowmaster's dark arts, came on in a relentless wave, heedless of their own lives in their hunger to rend and kill. "Just like old times, eh, Chris?" Reeves shouted over the din of battle, his face split by a fierce grin. Campbell barked a laugh, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Marcus." They battled their way deeper into the station, the corridors slick with blood and viscera. The Shadowmasters threw everything they had at the intruders, gene-forged horrors, heavily armed shock troops, even the station's own automated defenses. But Campbell's team was unstoppable. Their skills honed by 100 campaigns and their bond unbreakable. They fought as one, each movement synchronized, each shot precise. And always Shadow and Titan were at the vanguard, their presence a rallying cry for the humans and a terror to their foes. At last they breached the central control room, a vast chamber pulsing with malevolent energies. And there, waiting for them, was the Overlord himself, a towering figure cloaked in shadow, his eyes burning with a cold, ancient intelligence. "Welcome, primitives," he rasped, his voice like the grinding of tombstones. "You have fought well to come this far, but your struggle is in vain. The void cannot be denied." Campbell stepped forward, his rifle leveled at the Overlord's heart. "We'll see about that. Your reign ends here, monster." With a gesture, he summoned a swirling vortex of darkness, a tear in the very fabric of reality. "Behold the true face of your doom." Campbell and his team recoiled as the void's unlight washed over them, a cold so intense it seared the lungs. They could feel it pulling at them, whispering seductively at the edges of their minds, promising oblivion and release. But Shadow and Titan, linked to the void in ways even their creators did not fully understand, stood firm. They placed themselves between their human companions and the swirling abyss, their forms shimmering with an inner radiance. "No," Shadow growled, his voice echoing strangely. "We are more than your tools, Shadowmaster. We choose our own path." The Overlord's eyes narrowed. "Then you shall be the first to be consumed." He lashed out with tendrils of pure darkness, seeking to ensnare the defiant creatures. But Shadow and Titan met the attack head-on, their own energies flaring to counter the void's hungry pull. The chamber shook with the force of their clash, reality itself buckling under the strain. Campbell and Reeves, shielding their eyes against the maelstrom of light and shadow, could only watch in awe as their companions battled a power beyond human comprehension. But even the greatest warriors had their limits. As the struggle reached its crescendo, Titan faltered, a lance of darkness piercing his mighty form. The Thunder Tusk let out a bellow of agony and crashed to the floor, his lifeblood pooling beneath him. "Titan, no!" Reeves screamed, rushing to his fallen friend's side. But it was too late. With a final, shuddering breath, the mighty beast was gone. Shadow, seeing his comrade fall, let out a howl of rage and grief. His form blazed with an incandescent fury as he channeled the full might of his bond with Campbell, drawing upon the strength of their shared spirit. In a blinding flash, the Dreadwolf leapt at the Overlord, jaws agape. The Shadowmaster tried to bring his dark powers to bear, but Shadow was too quick. In a single savage motion, he tore out the ancient being's throat, choking off his scream of terror and denial. But the act took a terrible toll. As the Overlord's lifeless form crumpled to the deck, Shadow too began to fade, his essence unraveling as the void's energies consumed him from within. "Say it's all right, Chris," the Dreadwolf said, his voice a fading whisper. "This is how it must be. The void must have its due." With a final mournful howl, Shadow vanished, drawn into the swirling vortex that was already beginning to collapse in upon itself with the Overlord's death. Campbell fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to the spot where Shadow had last stood. But there was nothing left to grasp, nothing left to hold on to. His friend, his brother in all but blood, was gone. Reeves, cradling Titan's massive head in his lap, met Campbell's gaze with a look of shared anguish. Around them, the station shuddered and groaned as the energies the Overlord had unleashed began to tear it apart from within. "Chris, we have to go," Reeves said, his voice thick with grief. "We can't let their sacrifice be in vain." Campbell nodded, forcing himself to stand on legs that felt like rubber. He keyed his comms, broadcasting to the fleet still embattled outside. "All units, this is Colonel Campbell. The Overlord is dead and the Shadowmaster's plan has been thwarted, but the station is coming apart. Evacuate immediately and rendezvous at the fallback coordinates. Repeat, evacuate immediately." Acknowledgements flooded the channel as ships began to disengage and flee, racing to outpace the growing maelstrom of energy consuming the station. Campbell and Reeves, supporting each other, limped towards the nearest hangar bay, where a battered transport was already waiting. They stumbled aboard, sealing the hatch behind them just as the first explosions began to rip through the station's superstructure. The pilot, a grim-faced Saurian, wasted no time in gunning the engines and blasting free of the doomed installation. As they tore through the roiling nebula, the station detonated behind them, a cataclysmic blast that outshone the local star. The shockwave buffeted the tiny ship, nearly sending it tumbling end over end, but somehow they held course, riding the edge of the storm. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The nebula fell still, the Shadowmaster's stronghold reduced to a spreading cloud of dust and debris. The Void's energies, no longer held in check, dissipated into the cosmic background, a half-remembered nightmare fading with the dawn. In the sudden silence, Campbell and Reeves could only hold each other, their grief a palpable force. They had won, but the cost had been higher than either could have imagined. Shadow, Titan, and so many other brave souls, human and alien alike, had given their lives to secure this victory. As they set course for the distant gleam of home, Campbell knew that the scars of this battle would never truly heal. The galaxy would move on, as it always did, but for those who had fought and bled and lost, the memory would endure. And though the Shadowmasters had been defeated, Campbell couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Void, that hungering abyss beyond the stars, still lurked in the darkness, waiting for its chance to feed. He would have to be ready. They all would. Because one thing was certain, the bond between humans and their creature companions, that unbreakable connection that had seen them through the fires of war and the depths of space, would be needed now more than ever. The battle was over, but the war, Campbell feared, was just beginning. Uncharted stars streaked past the Shadowhawk's viewports as Campbell and his team hurtled through the void, their hearts heavy with a desperate hope. The mysterious coordinates, their last tenuous link to their fallen comrade, glowed on the nav screen like a beacon in the darkness. Days stretched into weeks as they ventured deeper into the unknown reaches of the galaxy, the ship's sensors probing the emptiness for any sign of their destination. Tensions ran high, the weight of their quest bearing down on every member of the crew. At last, a desolate world swam into view, its surface a patchwork of rusted dunes and jagged obsidian peaks. Campbell felt a shiver run down his spine as he gazed upon the barren vista. Something about this place felt ancient, alien, and unspeakably wrong. The Shadowhawk touched down in a swirl of red dust, its landing gear crunching on the corroded surface. Campbell and his team disembarked, their weapons at the ready, their senses straining for any hint of danger in the eerie stillness. As they picked their way through the crumbling ruins of a long-dead civilization, Campbell couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, his instincts screaming a silent warning. A flicker of movement caught his eye and he spun, pulse rifle snapping up to his shoulder. But it was too late. A horde of twisted, snarling creatures burst from the shadows, their bodies a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical parts. At their head, a figure in battle-scarred armor lunged forward, a wickedly curved blade clutched in its clawed hands. Campbell's heart seized in his chest as he recognized the familiar contours of the armor, the way the warrior moved with a predatory grace that he knew all too well. "Shadow?" he breathed, his voice cracking with disbelief and a desperate, aching hope. But the figure showed no sign of recognition, no flicker of the bond that had once tied them together. With a roar of unthinking rage, Shadow charged, his blade slashing through the air in a blur of silver. Campbell barely had time to parry the blow, the force of the impact sending shockwaves up his arm. He staggered back, his mind reeling, as his team engaged the other creatures in a brutal, chaotic melee. Plasma bolts and razor-edged talons flew as the two sides clashed, the ruins echoing with the sounds of battle. Campbell ducked and weaved, his rifle spitting death, even as his heart ached with every shot. He could see now that Shadow's armor was fused with some kind of pulsing alien technology, the same eerie sigils and patterns that had adorned the Shadow Master's creations. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Shadow had been taken, experimented on, his very being twisted to serve the enemy's dark purposes. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Campbell refused to give up. He had to believe that some part of his friend still lived, buried beneath the layers of programming and control. With a wordless cry, he lunged forward, tackling Shadow to the ground in a tangle of limbs and armor. They grappled in the dust, their weapons forgotten, as Campbell scrabbled at the pulsing nodes embedded in Shadow's armor. One of the nodes came away in his hand with a sickening crunch, and Shadow convulsed, a howl of agony tearing from his throat. For a moment his eyes cleared, a flicker of recognition sparking in their depths. "Shadow, it's me," Campbell pleaded, his voice raw with emotion. "Remember who you are, everything we've been through together. You're not their weapon. You're my friend, my brother." Shadow twitched and shuddered, his face contorting as he struggled against the insidious programming that held him in thrall. "Chris," he rasped, his voice a distorted, crackling shadow of its former self. I can't—" But before Campbell could respond, before he could reach out and grasp the fragile thread of hope, the moment shattered. Shadow's eyes flared with a sickly, pulsing light, and he lashed out with a howl of mindless fury, his claws raking across Campbell's chestplate. Campbell reeled back, his heart sinking as he realized the awful truth. The Shadow Master's control was too strong, too deeply embedded. There was only one way to free his friend, to grant him the peace he deserved. With tears streaming down his face, Campbell drew his sidearm, the weapon shaking in his grip. He dodged and rolled as Shadow came at him in a whirlwind of slashing talons, his movements precise and ruthless, driven by a cold, merciless purpose. In a last desperate gambit, Campbell feinted left, then lunged right, coming up behind Shadow in a crouch. With a sob of anguish, he jammed his gun against a weak point in Shadow's armor and pulled the trigger, the plasma grenade detonating in a blinding flash of light and heat. The explosion consumed them both, hurling them apart in a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. Campbell slammed into a crumbling wall, his armor shrieking with alarms, his vision swimming with static. Through the haze of pain and smoke, he glimpsed Shadow's motionless form lying in the rubble, the twisted remnants of his armor still sparking and sputtering. With a groan of effort, Campbell dragged himself across the shattered ground, every movement sending fresh agony lancing through his battered body. He reached Shadow's side and cradled his head in his lap, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. Shadow's eyes flickered open, clear and bright, no longer clouded by the Shadow Master's vile influence. "Carissa," he whispered, his voice a thready rasp, "thank you for setting me free. Don't let our fight, our sacrifice, not be in vain. Remember our bond, and keep pushing back the darkness." Campbell nodded, his throat too tight to speak, as he watched the light fade from Shadow's eyes. He held his friend close, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, as the last embers of the explosion cooled and died around them. In the days that followed, Campbell and his team buried Shadow deep beneath the alien sands, a simple marker of stone and steel standing sentinel over his final resting place. They etched the symbol of their bond, the emblem that had once adorned Shadow's armor, into the weathered metal a promise and a remembrance. As the Shadowhawk lifted off, leaving the desolate world behind, Campbell stood at the viewport, his gaze fixed on the stars. He could feel the weight of Shadow's legacy settling on his shoulders, a mantle of duty and purpose that he would carry for the rest of his days. The fight against the Shadow Masters, against the darkness that threatened to engulf the galaxy, was far from over. But as long as he drew breath, as long as the memory of his bond with Shadow burned bright in his heart, Campbell knew that he would never stop fighting. He would be the light in the darkness, the beacon of hope for all those who struggled against the tide of shadows. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.